Hey guys, welcome back. Tisha here, and we are back. It's long overdue for another chapter read of Becoming Free Indeed. I am so sorry. I got sick and I just could not function. I'm still not at 100%. So if I do a nasty cough, I apologize. There's still some residual cold here, but I'm much better than I was, and I'm feeling more and more like myself each day, and I was eager to get back into this book. We're going to be reading chapter 2, A Zeal for God. Let's begin. For most teenage girls, seeing their private diary for sale on eBay would be their worst possible nightmare. I know that's right. Secret thoughts about boys, parents, and siblings, all available for the world to see. Honestly, what could be worse for a girl trying to figure out who she is, what she is passionate about, and what she believes? Thankfully, when I faced that exact scenario at the tender age of 14, there was hardly anything shocking for the thief to turn into a prophet. So someone stole her diary? Goodness gracious. If that happened to me, I would be mortified. Perhaps that's why the person who stole my journal during a visit to our home returned it a few weeks later. I still have the journal. From time to time, I leaf through the colorful paper and adolescent handwriting and see glimpses of how self-conscious I once was. I mostly use the journal to record what I did each day. These entries included bullet-pointed lists of visitors to our home, tasks accomplished, and friends seen. When I read it today, I'm struck by what is missing. I was afraid to say the wrong thing, to confess my inner desires, even in a diary. I didn't express any of the feelings and fears that were a constant part of my childhood. Wow. So even in a moment that is supposed to be freeing, that is supposed to be a place where you can express your thoughts, she was concerned about what she would put on paper. Rather than serving as a true chronicle of Ginger Duggar's inner life, my diary was yet another place of performance. A tool where I practiced projecting the version of myself that I wanted everyone, parents, siblings, friends, fans of the show, to see. What I was hiding from my journal, from fans of the show, and often from my loved ones, wasn't a dark, rebellious spirit. I never dreamed of leaving my family. I genuinely love my parents and siblings. My parents are kind, loving, and gracious, and they made a happy home for us kids. From spontaneous family bike rides to games of kickball in the backyard to RV trips across the country, they sought to invest in us and be present in our lives. Mine was a sweet childhood. No, I wasn't longing for a different life. I loved my life. What I was hiding from the world was my fear. Interesting to see that she sees nothing but good from her parents. At least that's what she's mentioning here. Becoming filled with fear. If there's one word, one emotion that best describes my younger self, it's fear. My earliest memory is a moment of sheer terror. I was 5 years old. My family was living in Little Rock, the capital of Arkansas. My dad, Jim Bob, was a part of state legislator. One day, while my dad was at the Capitol building, a tornado touched down close to our house. My mom, Michelle, ushered my siblings and me into the bathroom. There must have been 11 children at that time. A bunch of us huddled in the bathroom. I'll never forget my overwhelming anxiety as I stared out the window, convinced the tornado was about to destroy our house and my family. That is a scary experience because with tornadoes, you really don't know where they're going to touch down. And they do a lot of damage in such a quick time. So she probably was very fearful. Thankfully, the storm passed, but the fear stayed for years. Thunder terrified me. If I heard it, I'd cry, my body would shake, and I'd panic, thinking another tornado was heading right for us. If a storm came at night, I'd wake my parents, occasionally ending up on a cot in their bedroom. Wow. As I grew older, my fears grew in number. I began to worry that someone in my family would get cancer or some other horrible disease, and I'd have to watch my loved one die. I feared car crashes on the road and snakes in the woods. But by the time I was 14, my worst, Most all-consuming fear was the fear of what others thought of me. I don't remember exactly when a desire to please others started to dominate my thinking and decision making. Perhaps it was when the cameras arrived. I was 10 years old at that time, and I realized that millions of people were watching how I lived my life. Or perhaps I was always going to care about the opinions of others and want to hide my imperfections. I'm a people pleaser who has always preferred to go with the flow than to share my opinions or make demands. It seems like a lot of them are people pleasers, which isn't necessarily bad, but it can become bad if it's something that you're constantly doing, putting the thoughts of others before even the thoughts of yourself. For years, I thought the best way to please others was to hide my imperfections. This led to some harmful behaviors, including the eating disorder I developed early in my teenage years. I did not know that she had an eating disorder. Convinced my body was an embarrassment, I ate very little. I'd go days hardly consuming any calories. My weight dropped, but my body image did not improve. It almost never does in those situations because the weight isn't the problem. No matter how thin I wasn't satisfied with the way I looked. This obsession with body image was terrible for my physical health, and it certainly wasn't good for me spiritually, and it certainly didn't help that she was being filmed for national television having those problems. I wonder if her parents were aware. It was a downward spiral that could have gotten worse and worse. Thankfully, my eating struggles were short-lived, in large part due to my mom's help. Okay, good. She listened to me. She asked me to text her what I was eating and how often. Good job, Michelle. She also monitored my workout schedule and even turned this into an opportunity to keep her accountable with working out. It was a great way for us to be partners in taking care of our health. So that's good. I can appreciate the fact that her mother was there for her, noticed that something was wrong, and found a solution to making sure that she didn't stay stuck in that unhealthy way of managing her eating. Then, at the end of any given day, we talk about our days. She'd encourage me to make wise choices and get the right number of calories to sustain my body and thrive. I didn't feel judged at all. Mom had shared with me what she shared with the world. She had struggled with her eating too when she was my age. I felt no judgment from her, just loved and cared. I knew I was going to be okay because she had been through it. It helped me to know that I could eat sufficient calories in a healthy way. Grilled chicken, rice, salad, vegetables. Mom gave me the confidence to know I don't have to avoid food to be pretty. I struggled with self-image because I feared people. I was terrified of the weather and sickness because I feared death. And at the foundation of these fears was a truth about my identity. I did not love God. Finding my faith. As a teenager, I would have called myself a Christian, and nearly everyone around me called themselves Christians too. I was sure that God existed. To me, he was real as my family, and I knew that God was more than just the being who created everything. He was also in charge of the world and actively upholding the universe by the word of his power. Hebrews 1:3. He not only created the world and sustained it, but also guided my life and described it in Psalms 139. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Verses 13-16. I'd always given thanks to God for his kindness to me, and I assumed that my rank in the Duggar family tree, 6, my brunette hair, and my personality were gifts from God. But before I was 14 years old, there were major problems with my Christian identity. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. I had the first part down. I believe God existed, but the second part, seeking him, I wasn't doing that. Sure, I recited the prayer of salvation when I was younger, but I didn't really understand repentance. In other words, I wasn't truly sorry when I dishonored and disobeyed God. From time to time, I felt bad about my sin or worried about what my parents would think of me, but I cared more about my own happiness than the glory of God. I don't think she should be hard on herself for that. I think that when you're younger, a lot of times, not saying that that's always the case, but a lot of children are doing things to please their parents or because they're being told by their parents. Are they truly developing their own relationship with God, or are they going through the motions? I know when I think back to that time, there were times where I know I was just going through the motions. So I don't think she should be hard on herself for that. By God's grace, that changed when I was 14. I remember feeling terrified that I didn't truly love Jesus, so I went and found my mom and asked if we could talk. Of course, she said yes. We went into a little prayer closet in our home. I remember crying and telling her that I didn't believe I genuinely loved God. I knew a lot about how to act, things to do and not to do, but none of it was driven by a love for God. It was more about a desire to perform, looking good in front of the others, or to follow the status quo. I was tired of living this way, trying to be a Christian without God's help. It was draining and I was exhausted. My religious tank was empty. I realized that I had been wrestling with these feelings for about a year, but was just too embarrassed to tell anyone. I was consumed with worry about what they would think of me. They saw me as a Christian, a good kid. My pride did not want to let me admit that I had been putting on a hypocritical show, but I couldn't stand to exist in that hypocrisy anymore. I confessed this to my mom and started to cry. I wanted to really know God. I wanted to love and worship him and enjoy a relationship with him for the first time. I don't remember what she said to me, but I know I cried out to God and asked him to save me from my sin. I had been living for myself, not for God, but that day a real change happened in my heart. I became committed to living my life to honor God. This change didn't happen because I prayed a certain prayer with the exact right words. I was simply tired of being a performance artist, a religious play actor, a hypocrite. I wanted the real thing. I wanted a relationship with God because pleasing him was now my top priority. The fear of others no longer consumed me. I'm still prone to people pleasing, but making others happy no longer dominates my thinking. In the same way, when I became a true Christian, I didn't fear death as much. I knew that when I died, I was going to heaven. Of course, I still didn't want to get in a car wreck, contract a fatal disease, or encounter a tornado, but I knew in my heart that if anything like that happened, I would be in the presence of God, fearing my new faith. Despite all this progress, I still struggled with fear. The subject changed, but the intensity remained the same. Specifically, I was afraid that I wasn't obeying and honoring God adequately. I constantly wondered if God was displeased with me. I wanted his approval more than anything, but really didn't know what it looked like to have a relationship with him. I wanted to be close to God, but was confused about how exactly to get there. So much of my uncertainty was because I didn't understand God's character. Instead of thinking of him as a kind creator who wanted me to obey him for my own good and for his glory, I primarily thought of God as a stern and harsh. I had this idea that he would be disappointed, even angry, if I didn't do exactly what he wanted me to do. And I'm guaranteeing a lot of that has to be with what she was taught through her parents and through their religious choices. Even if I didn't know what he wanted from me in a situation, I thought I could get in trouble for making the wrong choice. For instance, throughout my teenage years, one of my family's favorite pastimes was broomball, a game similar to hockey that is played on an ice rink while wearing shoes, not skates. We would play several times a week. I especially enjoy the game and look forward to the time with my family. But after that chat with my mom, I started to fear that God didn't want me to play. I thought he might instead want me to read my Bible, pray, or do something for others, like help my mom around the house. I didn't think there was anything inherently wrong with broomball. It wasn't a sin for my siblings to play, but I couldn't shake the feeling that broomball wasn't the best use of my time in God's eyes. I even began to fear that if I did go play, that wasn't what God wanted me to do. He would punish me by causing my family to get into a car wreck on the way to the ice rink. Goodness gracious. Soon, this uncertainty came with nearly every invitation to do something enjoyable. If it was fun and I had to decide whether to participate, then I'd second guess myself, thinking I should instead choose a spiritual activity. I'll never forget the uncertainty I felt when Grandma Duggar would invite me to go shopping. My siblings would ask me to go somewhere, or I'd have free time and I want to use it to exercise or relax. I didn't know then that I was experiencing an overactive conscience. In fact, if you had told me that this was an issue with my conscience, I would have had no idea what you were talking about. I didn't really understand what the conscience was at the time. I mean, I knew I had one, but I didn't quite understand its purpose. My pastor provides this helpful definition of conscience. The conscience entreats you to do what you believe is right and restrains you from doing what you believe is wrong. But don't equate the conscience with the voice of God or the law of God. It's human. It's a human faculty that judges your actions and thoughts by the light of the highest standard you perceive. When you violate your conscience, it condemns you, triggering feelings of shame, anguish, regret, anxiety, disgrace, and even fear. Conversely, when you follow your conscience, it condemns you, brings joy. It commends you, brings joy, serenity, self-respect, well-being, and gladness. When I was feeling guilty about broomball, that was not God speaking to me. That was my conscience. I didn't know I was training my conscience to tell me that anytime I decided to play a game instead of reading my Bible, I was disobeying God. Of course, the problem wasn't that I had a conscience. It's a gift from the Lord that we should thank him for. The problem was that my conscience was too active. I trained it to feel guilt for decisions that the Bible didn't condemn. In some cases, things that the Bible encourages, such as exercise or spending time with family, would violate my conscience. I remember multiple times when my family watched a fun movie together while I was upstairs reading my Bible, thinking that's what I should be doing instead. Mornings could be particularly stressful. I wake up and immediately start thinking about what I could do that day to best please God. I am so happy that this was not my story, because that is a lot to put on yourself at that age, to be so driven by wanting to please God that you feel guilty about having a good time. Often fasting was one of the first things that came to mind. The Bible talks about fasting as an acceptable spiritual practice, but it never commands believers to fast. Yet, if I felt convicted about fasting, I would tell myself I couldn't have food that day. I convinced myself that if I ate, God would not be pleased with me. This was different from the struggle I had with food a few years earlier. Back then, I was worried about what people thought of me. I avoided food because I wanted to appear thin. My concerns with fasting were because I was worried about what God thought of me. My previous struggles with food didn't cross my mind when I tried to figure out if I should fast or not, but it did cross my parents' minds. For that reason, they encouraged me to eat. In fact, my parents directly told me not to fast at that time. So much of my fear and anxiety after I became Christian was tied to my overactive conscience. I had created a false standard of righteousness, standards that were impossible for me or anyone to measure up to. But where did those false standards come from? At the time, I thought my convictions came from the Bible. Now I know that that wasn't the case. Now I know that instead of coming from the perfect word of God, they came from the mind of an imperfect man. Following Bill Gothard. Now, we all know about Bill Gothard. Let's hear what she has to say. For as long as I can remember, I followed the teachings of a man named Bill Gothard. My parents introduced me and my siblings to Gothard and his seminars. They started listening to his teachings not long after they were married. So they started listening to this man before they even had children, which shows you how heavily his teachings were involved in the way that they evolved, interacted, maneuvered, the way that they did things as a family. And they applied many of his principles as they raised me and my siblings. It's no exaggeration to say that Gothard was the most important influence in my life outside of the family. Gothard, not God. She's saying it right there. There wasn't a time when I didn't know who he was and I admired him. In my diary that was stolen and listed on eBay, I said I couldn't wait to go on one of his conferences for the first time. I remember someone telling me they thought that Bill Gothard might be a prophet, a modern-day Elijah sent by God to show Christians how to obey God's word. So who exactly is this spiritual leader? Bill Gothard was raised by Christian parents, and he committed to full-time ministry at the age of 15. He attended Wheaton College, where he received 2 degrees. When he was a student, he started working with Chicago's inner city youth. He continued to do that until Wheaton College asked him to come back and teach a course on youth ministry. The curriculum he designed for that class became the basic seminar for the Institute in Basic Life Principles, the IBLP. In the late 1960s, Gothard started teaching his seminars at churches, Christian schools, camps, and youth programs around the country. His timing could not have been better. Throughout the 1960s, America's sexual revolution had changed the way many people thought about religion and morality. Millions of Americans stopped saving sex for marriage. Divorce became more common. Isn't it interesting that this man, who we now know had sexual immorality himself, took advantage of that time period? Drug use skyrocketed. Young people embraced rock and roll, and they use this music to express their independence and live a self-absorbed lifestyle. On top of all that, Americans were dealing with racial tensions, the war in Vietnam, and the threat of nuclear war in the Soviet Union. For Bible-believing Christians, this was a scary, uncertain time. Parents feared losing their children to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Bill Gothard offered parents confidence. In his lectures, he claimed he discovered the key to a successful Christian life. According to Gothard, to enjoy God's blessing, a Christian should closely follow the 7 principles he laid out in his seminars. The principles of design, authority, responsibility, suffering, ownership, freedom, and success. These are universal. They are non-optional. Every single person in the world must build his or her life around these 7 principles. If we don't build our lives around these 7 principles, then we're going to have these root problems. We'll have surface wrong attitudes and surface problems, and our life will be one continuous failure from what God knows our potential could be. She has a footnote here, which makes me wonder what that is. Chapter 2, notes. Chapter 2, and it says 5 beside it. Okay, that's a direct thing from, that's a direct passage from his How to Trace Problems to Root Causes. Wow. Okay. In later chapters, I'll talk in more detail about these principles and how they dominated my life. Okay, so she's going to talk more about him. But for now, I want to talk about why these principles were effective. First, they were absolute. Gothard spoke in black and white terms. He said there was a right way and a wrong way to live. For those who lived the right way, who followed his principles, God's blessings were guaranteed. Health, money, success, and happiness were available to him. Second, his principles were practical. They could be applied immediately. Someone could leave Gothard's seminars with a dozen ways to change his or her life. None of his ideas were presented as theoretical. Even when Gothard claimed what he was saying was based on the Bible, he always stressed practical applications. He often urged people to make a vow after one of his seminars that they would immediately apply what they learned. So this man had such an influence on these people so quickly that he was able to convince some of them after just one seminar to immediately follow his teachings. That's dangerous. Finally, those principles were specific. Gothard would teach a principle and then tell you exactly what the principle looked like in everyday life. For instance, when discussing the topic of modesty, which fell under the principle of responsibility, among others, he identified which outfits were modest and which were not. Long skirts were, which is why my sisters and I wore them all the time, even when we were sleeping or swimming. What? These children wore long skirts when they went to sleep. So what would happen if they do like me, where they sleep in the nude? TMI, but I'm just saying, I don't sleep with clothing on. So what would be said to me if they have to sleep with a skirt on? That may seem too strict for many, But for millions of Americans, it was comforting and liberating. Millions of people followed this? Is that what she's saying? These rules were clear and easy to follow. And according to Gothard, following his principles was the same as obeying God. For the nervous Christian parent, these principles were the perfect cure to the moral chaos of the 1960s and 70s. A few years after he started teaching his principles across the country, Gothard was filling stadiums. He was an evangelical celebrity, reaping what I'd sown. By the time I was born in 1993, an entire Christian subculture had formed around Gothard's teaching. I was born into that subculture. The certainty of his teachings, the guarantees he promised, attracted many Christian parents in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, including mine. He talked a lot about reaping what you sow. The idea was that if you planted the right lifestyle, in other words, made choices that aligned with his teachings, then God would bless your life and you would reap the lifestyle that you had sowed. It's interesting how he uses certain terms that are in the Bible and then interchanges them to able to have his narrative. That method of success gave thousands a sense of control as the world around them seemed to be falling apart. Here's an example of this teaching from Gothard. Life is hooked up in very delicate cause and effect sequence. Here's a man who wonders why he's having business problems, financial problems. He doesn't know that God has a clear relationship between his moral life and his business life. Now, there are other relations too that would affect business, but that's just one. Here's a person who wonders why his children are reacting. He doesn't know what God has a very clear relationship between his honoring of his parents and the response of his children to him. And in more and more ways, God has a very clear cause and effect sequence. Wow. It sounds like he just rambles. I'm just saying what I say. At least that example does. That lesson was both comforting and terrifying to me. It was comforting because it turned life into a series of deposits and withdrawals. All I had to do was deposit the exact lifestyle Gothard advocated, and I would withdraw health, money, a wonderful husband, and a bushel of godly kids. But this cause and effect view was also terrifying because I thought I would experience devastating consequences for any mistakes I made, which kind of goes back to the umbrella thing that Jill was talking about. For years, I was convinced that Bill Gothard was the finest Bible teacher in America and that his so-called secrets to success were the path to personal fulfillment. Even though a lot of what he's saying isn't biblical, she thought that he was the finest biblical teacher. It's so interesting how when you don't take the time to read different things for yourself, and I'm someone who would be, I've said this before, who would be labeled as a believer, but I don't think that one religion has it all right. I feel like there is good in all, okay? And I take various things from different religions, right? So it's interesting that she hasn't done at this point any additional studying. She just went off of what she was taught by her parents, which was that this guy was close to God, basically. Through those years, I had a self-righteous attitude. I pitied those who didn't follow these principles. I thought their ignorance would lead to a life of spiritual darkness. They miss out on God's blessing and protection because they didn't know these principles. When millions of people watched me on television during my teenage years, they saw a girl who was putting these principles into action in every area of her life. She was committed. She was convinced that she had found the secret to success. I certainly had a unique childhood, but my spiritual journey is not that different from anyone else's. Many were also influenced by Bill Gothard's teachings. Others have had someone tell them that a certain teaching came from God when it really just came from a man. And others have been pressured to follow a set of extra rules in addition to the commands in Scripture in order to be acceptable to God. In that circumstance, the question they eventually face is the same one I face. How do I know whether what I believe is consistent with the Word of God or is a false religious system invented by man? There are often elements of truth mixed in with false teaching. That's true. There are often good ideas that help honor God, tangled with bad ideas that cause a lot of heartache. How do you know the difference? How do you disentangle the truth from error? For me, the disentanglement process began with the understanding what the Bible actually says and comparing it to what Gothard said. Did they match up? Finding the answer required a closer look at Gothard's 7 basic life principles, the same principles I had been applying in front of reality TV audiences throughout my childhood. And that is the end of chapter 2. And it's interesting to see her approach. It's obvious that it's going to be different from Jill's, and that's okay. I'm going to do better, and I'm going to keep an open mind. I do feel like this chapter was better than the first chapter. I do see that she's kind of creating the narrative for this, and it looks like it's going to be more about how she became free from Gothard. That's what it seems like to me. You all, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think of what she said so far in this chapter. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.